Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots. I'd encourage you, today's reading is on the shorter side, and so I encourage you to stay at the end. I will have some photographs that relate to this story that you might enjoy seeing. But let's get to the story. Last week we left off with Stringer having arrived at Fort McPherson and having sent the dogs back. Both Stringer and the bishop arrived at the same morning. The bishop brought with him Spendlove and his wife, the missionaries from Fort Simpson, John Helsky, who was bound for the Klondike. In addition, Archdeacon MacDonald and Whitaker were already at the fort. Whether the bishop, in seeing such a gathering, decided on the impulse of the moment to hold a conference, or whether it had been planned in advance, is not clear. At all events, a conference was held. The bishop opened the proceedings with a survey of the existing situation, after which each of the workers spoke on a particular phase of the work. It was rather elaborate, commented Stringer. Stringer himself spoke on the certainty of God's promises, Whitaker on the imperfections of the work and lack of opportunity, and finally Archdeacon MacDonald gave an address on the history of Indian missions in the North. The rest of the day was devoted to business matters and practical details. There were many things to be considered, among them Sabbath desecration, beer-making, the freight rates charged by the Hudson's Bay Company, and the superannuation fund. A week or so after the conference, the Wrigley appeared with supplies and mail. When the steamer left 2 days later, she had Stringer's whaleboat in tow, affording him an easy passage to the mouth of the Peel River. Parting company with the steamer, he continued down the Mackenzie to visit the Eskimos and whaling ships at Bailey Island to the northeast, reaching there at the beginning of August. During this period, discouragement and anxiety gripped him. His health was precarious. His eyes and throat were giving him considerable trouble. He was deeply concerned for his wife and family at Herschel Island, knowing them to be short of supplies. He was discouraged by the lack of response among the Eskimos, and dismayed by the baneful influences of some of the whalers. Small wonder that during this visit the weary missionary confided to his diary, quote, "I feel that the Huskies are no nearer to accepting our religion than they ever were. Kutok and Koklik, it seemed, have a second wife each, and they do not regard Sunday much more than they did years ago. I feel completely discouraged. Where is the fault? In what have I failed?" Unquote. When he had been at Bailey Island for nearly 2 weeks, Stringer received word from a passing whaling ship captain that he was going westwards and would gladly take him to Herschel Island. Reluctant to leave his work, yet glad of the speedy and comfortable return to his family, he accepted. He reached home on August 23rd after an absence of 2 months, overjoyed to find his family safe and well. 3 days later, the Grampus, the last ship of the year, left the island, taking the outgoing mail to San Francisco and leaving the missionaries to another winter of Arctic night. During November 1900, the Stringers spent some time preparing a book of hymns and prayers in Eskimo. It was typewritten and reproduced to form a slim pamphlet covered with oilcloth. The hymns were all of the evangelistic missions variety. In addition, the book contained the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and a number of verses of Scripture. These booklets were distributed to the Eskimos who could read. The Stringers, assisted by Will Young, conducted a school for the Eskimos. The instruction was given at first in English, and was confined to reading, writing, and arithmetic. An examination was held at Christmas, and prizes were awarded for general proficiency. Following the prize-giving, there was a Christmas party, at which Mrs. Stringer appeared as Santa Claus, to everyone's amusement and entertainment. As with all language work, the missionaries found difficulties in translation. As Stringer remarked, after trying to tell the Eskimos the Bible account of creation, quote, "They have no name for snake or serpent, having never seen one," unquote. Archdeacon MacDonald overcame similar difficulties in translating, quote, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and guileless as doves," unquote. Into Tukish Indian as, quote, "Be ye therefore as wise as a weasel, and as harmless as a seal pup, unquote. At the beginning of 1901, Stringer began to do his teaching in the Eskimo language, but made no comment of his success. About this time, the missionary became the owner of a still. Sometimes an Eskimo would barter valuable furs for pipes and vessels necessary to distill tonga, a native whiskey which they drank freely when it was available, endangering their own health and the lives of others. Knowing that such a still was being used in the community, Stringer wondered how he could put an end to it. After some thought, he took 50 pounds of flour, a gallon of molasses, 1.5 pounds of tea, and 3 pounds of coffee, and approached Avnik, the reputed owner of the still. Laying the provisions before him, he offered to buy the still. Avnik hesitated and seemed surprised that the missionary should imagine him to own such a thing. He did not deny it, but attracted by the prospect of the provisions, he said, "Give me more flour and tea, and I will trade." "This is a good offer," said Stringer. "Take it or leave it." The Eskimo took it, carried away his prizes, and returned with the still. By the time this transaction was completed, about 30 Eskimos had gathered. They were greatly intrigued by the proceedings, and curious to know why the missionary wanted the still. Now they wondered what he proposed to do with it. When the deal was concluded, and Avnik returned with the still, the missionary proclaimed loudly that the goods were Avnik's, and that the still was his now to do with as he pleased. Mystified, they agreed that this was undoubtedly true. Stringer then took the still, smashed it to pieces with an axe, and then bent and crushed each of the pipes to prevent further use. Truly, the ways of white men were strange. In the early summer of 1901, the Stringers once more made the journey to Fort McPherson to meet the Wrigley. They received their annual mail, stayed a few weeks, then returned to Herschel Island in the Messenger. Accompanying them on the return trip were Whitaker and his wife, who, with the assistance of W.D. Young, were to serve at the island post while the Stringers were on furlough. The next few weeks were busy as the missionaries packed and prepared for the long journey back to Ontario, knowing that they might not be returning to Eskimo work. On August 17th, they boarded the whaling steamer Narwhal. Isaac Stringer, Sadie his wife, their 2 children, Rowena and Herschel, both of whom had been born in the Arctic. "And so," Stringer wrote, "we scarcely realized that we were leaving Herschel Island for a long time, perhaps forever." Thus ended Stringer's close contact with the Eskimos as their missionary, although he retained to the end of his life an active interest in their welfare and in the work undertaken among them. What were the characteristics of his work as a missionary to the Eskimos? It was not a long ministry and lasted less than 10 years. Will Young was among them for a much longer period, and so was C.E. Whitaker. Isaac Stringer was the first permanent missionary to the Eskimos, and they honored and loved him on that account. In addition, he had a lively sense of vocation, a strong and simple faith, a deep conviction of having a gospel to share, and was always ready to believe the best of men of whatever race. He possessed an ability to be at one with the Eskimos, to enter into their life and to a degree into their thinking. In these he was able to gain their confidence, affection, and trust. These gifts were shared to the full with his wife. To the Eskimo, time was of very little importance. On a journey they would readily stop to fish or hunt for berries, even though they might lose the advantage of a fair wind by doing so. Some might have grown irritated and urged them like children to take advantage of the good weather and go on. Others might have waited, disdainfully impatient, as the Eskimos indulged in their fancies. Not Stringer. He would, if possible, go with them, not waiting for them as a superior nurse, waiting for refractory children, but taking part in their interests and activities with them until they were ready to move on. And that's the end of Chapter 5. I'll put up some pictures now of Isaac Stringer and some of the conditions up in the Arctic. I hope you've enjoyed the first 5 chapters. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 6. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.